Chapter 6. The Sock Queen of Alabama. The name Gina Locklear decided on for her brand Zcano was intended to pay homage to the rich Cherokee history in DeKalb County. The name loosely translates as a state of being good. Zcano socks would be made with certified organic cotton, grown without pesticides. The yarn was colored with low-impact dyes that were free of heavy metals and used less water. Gina sourced the cotton from Texas and worked with a dye house in North Carolina, keeping the supply chain onshore. She wanted to set her socks apart and appeal to a younger generation who, like her, cared about their health and the environment. She would honor the sock-making tradition of Fort Payne but do things in a new way. Gina had already adopted an organic diet, and she knew that in Northeast Alabama, where organic food wasn't widely available, organic clothing was a totally foreign concept. Are your socks free range? She heard that one a lot from folks in town. Terry and Regina didn't get the whole organic thing, either. In fact, they needed convincing in general about Gina's business plan. The Locklears had always manufactured socks for other companies as contract knitters. They had no experience designing, marketing, and selling their own brand. Most of all, they didn't want their daughter to do something that she'd soon tire of or come to regret. I know what it's like to run a factory, Terry warned her. He kept pushing Gina away. And Gina, willful and stormy as ever, kept pushing back. In 2009, MEG Knitting effectively became two businesses. Terry and Regina continued to knit, seam, and board socks for various customers, everything from hospital socks to compression socks for horses. They sent the goods out to another mill in town for packaging and fulfillment. Production orders, or POS, came in fits and bursts, now nothing like the glory days with Russell Athletic, but business had recovered since the depths of 2008. Meanwhile, Gina focused on Zcano, selling her socks direct to consumers through a website, much as American Giant would. Gina split her week between Birmingham and Fort Payne. On Sunday nights, she packed her travel bag with toiletries and a few days' worth of clothes, and first thing Monday morning, she got in her white Chevy Tahoe and drove to Fort Payne. It was an hour and a half drive north, all interstate, and Gina had her personal landmarks along the route. When she saw the Trussville exit, it meant that she was out of city traffic and could relax a bit, start enjoying her morning coffee. After the little town of Steele, the landscape turned scenic and mountainous, and she knew she was halfway home. Nikalula Falls was the exit the family used to take to visit her grandparents on her mother's side, and often when she passed it, she thought of them. She spent Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays at the mill, sleeping at her parents' house in her teenage bedroom. On Wednesdays after work, she drove back to Birmingham, where she tended to business matters the rest of the week. During busy production times, she spent Thursdays at the mill as well. Instead of tiring of the routine, the opposite happened. All her energy and passion seemed to have found the single-minded purpose they'd been seeking. At first, Zcano's production runs were so small, 40 or 50 pairs at a time, in only a few styles that a single knitting machine in the mill could produce the entire line. But as her business grew, Gina took over a row of Angies. In 2012, she married Al Vreeland, the Birmingham labor attorney who'd been so impressed by Fort Payne's entrepreneurial spirit and its devotion to socks. They'd been introduced by mutual friends at a Birmingham restaurant, and as they waited for their table, Al had impressed Gina by talking about fixers and loopers. It hadn't taken him long to discover that she was consumed by making socks. First thing she does when she wakes up in the morning, she doesn't brush her teeth, Al told me. She pulls out her phone to see how many orders came in overnight. It's the first thing she wants to know. Their wedding was in November, during the busy holiday production run. They had a small ceremony at the Loreto Chapel in Santa Fe, New Mexico, on a Saturday. We came home on Sunday, Gina said. And then I went to Fort Payne on Monday. That's my life. Gina started a second line, Little River Sock Mill, doubling her workload. Zcano was a youthful riot of stripes and colors. Little River featured more sophisticated patterns, like florals, and was sold through a wholesale model at boutiques like Margaret O'Leary. Then Gina started making socks for Natalie Channon of Alabama Channon, her organic cotton, Natalie's Designs. Customers sent her letters and emails praising the quality and originality of her socks, and whenever she set up at a farmer's market, her booth was swarmed. Her socks were catching on. So much so that Martha Stewart Living recognized Gina with an American Made Award in 2015, which the magazine presented each year to 10 makers around the country to encourage and support U.S. manufacturing. The company caught our eye because, first, we love the socks, but also, it's such a good story, Martha Stewart told me. Gina is rebuilding a business her parents built and making a town come to life again. It's a sensible business. Everyone needs socks. The award brought Gina national media attention, including a feature in Martha Stewart Living, which is how I came to learn about Zcano and the tradition of sock making in Fort Payne and found myself, a few months later, driving down Airport Road. The Locklears mill is painted a soft gray, and the flower beds in front give it a more attractive appearance than its industrial neighbors. When I arrived, Gina was in the larger of the two buildings, where the offices were located, working on spring orders at her computer. She had long brown hair, warm eyes, and a straightforward manner. Dressed in dark jeans and a blue and white checkered flannel shirt, she stood and shook my hand and said brightly, "Welcome to Fort Payne." Looking around Gina's office, I noticed that the decor was entirely related to hosiery. In the corner, a shelf was heaped with cones of yarn in bright colors. The main wall was taken up by two corkboards, each with socks pinned to it. These were SKUs, or sample styles, from the line currently in production, Gina said. The unusual-looking rug we stood on was made of factory second socks rejected because of runs or other flaws. At age 36, Gina had been making socks for 7 years by that point. We're in a place of happy right now, she said, explaining that sales were good and more stores were picking up her lines. She was still basking in the glow of the award, which had included a trip to New York to attend a banquet for the honorees. Also, the humble sock was having a high-fashion moment. Socks paired with dresses were showing up in the pages of Vogue, and models had walked a Miu Miu show in Merlin in Argyle socks. Let me show you some of our socks, Gina said, going over to a table piled with samples. Picking one up, she said, this is our signature style. It's a textured herringbone. Grabbing another, a cushioned short sock, or no show, she said, you have people who want a cushioned sock, and you have people for whom they're too thick. I personally love a cushioned sock. It is so soft. I wear these to the gym. In the fall and winter, Gina wore over-the-knee socks matched with long dresses during the daytime and wool socks to bed at night. In the summers, she wore no-shows with sneakers. I couldn't see what socks she had on that day under her brown boots. I was wearing gray socks my mother had given me for Christmas. For all her success, Gina had just 2 part-time employees at that point, and she handled practically every aspect of the business herself. She chose the season's colors, came up with the designs, ordered the yarn, did Zcano's social media and marketing, and processed credit card orders. She even acted as the customer service department, personally answering every call, email, Facebook message, and letter of praise or complaint. In the early days, before she brought in the part-timer to inspect and package socks, she did that job, too, while sitting on the living room floor in her parents' house at night and watching TV. The workload reflected not a reluctance to cede control but sheer economic necessity. Gina relied on her parents' business to support her brand, and as long as that was the case, she could not increase her overhead. As Gina explained all this, my eyes fell on a Zcano advertisement framed and hanging near the office door, a pair of shapely legs sporting calf-height socks. Gina laughed. She was also a sock model. The legs were hers. Gina's office shared a wall with her father's. Regina's was down the hall. That afternoon, the two of them joined us for lunch at the big mill, which hadn't been a sock factory for decades and was now an antique store and cafe. I liked the Locklears immediately and felt a kinship with them, having grown up in a small town of faded industry myself. Our hometowns were linked, I realized, not only by the same Appalachian chain but also by a common culture that ran down through those mountains, 800 miles to their southern boundary. When Terry mentioned Alabama's origins in Fort Payne, I remembered how the band's song, Mountain Music, used to play all the time in my hometown. Terry and Regina had been high school sweethearts. They'd wed in June 1965, following Regina's graduation, and they had the easy rapport of a long married couple, with the deeper bond of having worked together for so many years. Terry was friendly and outgoing. At 71, he bore a slight resemblance to Bill Clinton, same bulb nose and full white hair. Regina, who at 70 was quieter and more cautious in nature than her husband, had cropped dark hair and glasses. When the subject of their first mill, in the former chicken house, came up, Terry said bashfully, "I'm almost ashamed to tell you about it." I'll just tell you." "Tell him about the birds, it's a funny story," Regina prompted. "We had no air conditioning in that building," Terry said. "It had doors on both ends. Big doors. Like the whole end would open up. We would open those doors to get a little air going through there, and birds would actually fly through while you were working." That time starting out had bonded the family together, and the memories of it remained vivid. In the afternoons, after knitting all day, Regina would drive down the mountain to pick up the girls from school. Then it was back up to the mill, where Gina and Emily would pass the time until 10 o'clock, when they all went home. Gina was on the cusp of her teens and just discovering boys. Stuck with her parents on a remote mountaintop every day, she passed the hours listening to a boombox and pining. "Today," she said, "if I hear Neon Moon by Brooks and Dunn or Achy Breaky Heart by Billy Ray Cyrus, it takes me right back to that time." I asked them how MEG had survived when so many other mills hadn't made it. Why were the Locklears still in business? Terry said that he had often wondered that himself. He'd come up with a theory: the only way we made it is cause we were lean and we didn't have any debt, he said. We owed for nothing. We just didn't go away. We kept sitting here thinking something would come along. Sure enough, it did. Indeed, Gina's appearance in the mill had changed the course of the business in her parents' lives. They no longer thought about closing the mill and retiring. They felt reinvigorated. "I guess what Gina has done with this organic stuff has brought new life to what we do," said Terry. "To me, it's just almost like starting all over again." Regina added, "She knows more about the makeup of a sock than I do. And she can run a machine. I can't run a machine. She's taught us so much. So much. A lot more than we ever taught her." Gina's commitment and drive astonished her parents every day. "She's on fire," Regina said. That morning, Gina had shown me the heart of the mill, the room where socks were made. She led me down a hallway and opened a heavy, aluminum-clad soundproof door to the knitting room. It was about the size of a basketball court, windowless, and fluorescently lit, with 4 rows of machines running lengthwise. The machines' angies were boxy, like kitchen ovens, and teal in color. Above each one, at a little higher than eye level, creels hung from the ceiling. These metal racks held spools of off-white yarn that was fed down into the knitting machines. You could tell immediately which machines were dedicated to Gina's socks, because the yarn hanging in the creels was red, blue, pink, orange, yellow, purple, every color of the rainbow. All that fantastic floating color gave Gina's side of the knitting room a busy, cheerful atmosphere. In foreign factories, the cost of labor is so cheap that there is often a worker assigned to each machine. In U.S. plants, one worker may be responsible for an entire production line. At first, MEG seemed to contain no employees, only autonomously running machines. Far down one of the rows, I finally spotted a stocky man dressed in blue work clothes. He was bent over in concentration. Gina pointed out an orange light on a pole beside the machine. The light was blinking, signaling a malfunction. "That's Kenny," she said, speaking loudly to make herself heard over the high-pitched din of the factory. Kenny Young was a line knitter, overseeing all 40 angies on her parents' side. He worked alongside a creeler, who was responsible for keeping the correct yarns on the creels during knitting. Gina led me over to one of the angies. It was knitting a new style of Zcano sock. Thin metal fingers atop the machine moved up and down rapidly, pulling an orange yarn. Inside, I saw the silvery flash of the needles. This ange had 144 of them. Down the left side of the machine ran a clear plastic tube. Its function was initially a puzzle to me. Then, with a sudden whoosh and pop, a striped orange sock, complete but for the unseamed toe, spit out of the tube. Surprised and amazed, I burst out laughing. "I love that," exclaimed Gina. She had seen that finish thousands of times, but she hadn't lost her own delight at it. Before Gina came along, the mills in Fort Payne, including MEG, had always made essentially one type of sock, a white tube sock, the kind bought in packs of 6 at big box stores. White tube socks had built Fort Payne the way milk chocolate bars had built Hershey, Pennsylvania. In large part that's because it's easy for a mill to crank them out. The creels are numbered so that the spools loaded onto them are fed into the machine in a certain order that corresponds to a pattern. For white tube socks, a worker loads spools of white cotton yarn, elastic, and nylon, sets the machines to knit a basic pattern, and lets them run and run. Back in the 90s, one of Bobbio's contract knitters for DeSoto Mills made a single style of basic sock continuously, 6 days a week, for 4 years straight. But Gina envisioned fashion socks with pattern and color and whimsy, and to make them, you couldn't set the angies and let them run ad infinitum. You had to program the complex designs with computer software and come up with new designs each season. Basic socks were also designed with computer software, but the programs were much simpler than those required to produce a fashion sock. It meant continuously changing the settings, the order in which the machines took in yarn, and using a richer palette of color beyond off-white. Gina required technical expertise to achieve what she wanted. For that, she relied on Vance Veal. Vance was from the Fort Payne of old. His grandparents, his mother, his sister, and his 3 brothers had all worked in the mills. Vance's initiation came at 16, when he took an after-school job at Cooper Hosiery as a sock inspector. Later, that job became automated, but back in 1984, an inspector had to stick their arm up a knit sock and turn it inside out to check for runs in the yarn. During an 8-hour shift, Vance turned more than 1,000 socks. The repeated friction wore the hair off his arms. Eventually it rubbed his skin raw until his forearms bled. He had to take a week off work to heal. But he was making $3.35 an hour, good money to a teenager in those days, and he loved the atmosphere. The smell got me, Vance said. The oils, the machines. It was a new experience, and I liked the camaraderie. Wanting to get off third shift at another mill so that he could spend evenings with his wife and newborn son, Vance had come to work for the Locklears in 1994. He replaced Terry's old fixer, Sam, who'd spent his life working on banners and couldn't grasp the automated Angies. Terry had to get rid of the blowtorch because it was the first thing Sam reached for when a part broke. Terry called Vance's arrival a blessing, and over the years, Vance had assumed the role of MEGS production manager and plant manager. He was the only employee Terry and Regina had kept when they'd hit their lowest point and had to lay everyone else off. Gina had known Vance since she was a teenager. When she spotted him working in another part of the knitting room and called him over, she introduced him to me by saying, "This is Vance, he's like family." Gina and Vance proved to be a good team. He was easygoing and didn't have a problem taking orders from a woman, which was unusual in a factory environment. And though Vance wasn't a big talker, he had a way of nodding and mumbling, his lower lip bulging with the snuff he'd been dipping since age 14. He displayed a keen intelligence around any kind of machinery. Gina needed every bit of Vance's patience and skill because what she wanted to do was uncharted territory for them all. After making plain white socks all his life, Vance was suddenly on the phone with technicians from the Czech Republic, learning how he might code in the pattern so the machines would knit a 4-color flower on a curvy stem. He took it as an intellectual challenge. A basic sock is easy. When you run a pattern, you got to watch every little detail about a sock, Vance told me. You don't want a sock with the wrong color in a star or a flower. I remember when we made our first stripe together, Vance and me, Gina said. I didn't think we could make a stripe. It was the simplest stripe ever, but I was about to do cartwheels in the mill because we could do something other than a basic sock. That was the beginning. As Gina and Vance unlocked new capabilities, socks in candy colors and quirky designs began filling the knitting room. An orange polka dot anklet on a sage base. A slouch in black and white stripes. Socks in 6 different yarn colors. Socks featuring tiny flying geese, jumping foxes, tumbling dice, and antique bicycles. One Christmas, Gina designed a deer head with a rack of antlers on a sock she named the Buck. Her favorite patterns were vintage florals, a winter jasmine with a delicate brown stem, a dandelion with puffy pink florets, a curvy vined rose. Vance figured out how to run the complex programs on machines designed to make only very basic socks. As Terry put it, Vance tricked the machines into doing what he wanted. Gina grew more confident in her designs, too. In time, the florals became as intricate as antique wallpaper patterns, rendered in yarn. Gina was drawing on iconography of the South and of her own life to tell a story through her socks. One pattern she designed was inspired by traditional Southern quilts. Another featured a camellia, which was the state flower of Alabama and Gina's favorite. She and Al had planted them in their yard in Birmingham. A dog lover, she often put dogs on socks, retrievers, terriers. She gave every style a name, and the names had personal meanings, too. Lucy, a polka dot creation, honored Gina's grandmother. Forrest, a men's ribbed crew, referenced a street in Fort Payne on which she'd once lived. One year, the Z-Cando line included a men's sock with tiny El Caminos on it. When I asked why that model of car, Gina said, "My dad used to have one and drove me around in it when I was a kid." For especially complex patterns, Gina and Vance sometimes spent half the day tweaking a design and running dozens of samples to get one good SKU. In a honeyed voice, Gina said, "Vance is the most patient person ever." Vance blushed at the compliment. "Gina keeps me on my toes," he told me. "She's made me better at what I do." Later, with Vance out of earshot, Gina's voice got low and serious. "If something happened to Vance, I wouldn't know what we would do," she said. "He programs. He fixes the machines when they're not running right, which is a lot of the time. He runs my parents' side of the business dealing with the customers, so that's another role. He's truly the backbone of our socks." Vanceville belonged to a rare, vanishing breed in Fort Payne. When the sock industry left, Gina said, a lot of the workers left town. And their knowledge left, too. It was indicative of a larger problem in textiles, a lack of qualified workers that was in turn the result of being in an industry in long-term decline. Howard Cooley, the former executive at Jockey, had worked in the 1960s and 70s as an industry consultant, helping to open new factories. He went from town to town, factory to factory, spending anywhere from 6 to 9 months setting up the production of trousers, jeans, shirts, and outerwear. Through all that time he spent in mills, Cooley told me, he came to understand the subtle, incremental way in which workers gained knowledge at a factory. It's handed down, he said. People go to work in their teens or 20s, and they work with older textile workers, and they learn. There's a lot of what I call generational knowledge. Workers also learn by doing. Running a loom or napper every day for years, they developed an intimate understanding of the machine. They got to know its capabilities and quirks as one knows a family member. Danny Swafford, the factory owner in Tennessee, cut the garments himself, and he was excellent at it. In all the years I worked with him, said Taylor Johnston, the founder of Gamine, the women's workwear brand, I could count on one hand the mess UPS. He did it all. And it was precise. You can find a factory in LA to make denim. You cannot find a Danny Swafford. When a mill closed or an industry left a town, all that accumulated expertise disappeared. For the past 40 years, few new workers had been trained up. That's one of the reasons you can't recreate textiles in America very well today, Cooley said. Top management is easy, they just deal with the money. But middle management and foremen, okay? Lead operators that run textile mill equipment? It's very hands-on stuff. In the one-time sock capital of the world, Gina would have much trouble finding another veteran programmer like Vance or a young fixer to train up. One evening, Gina and I stopped for takeout at a barbecue place in town. It turned out that the guy behind the counter, a broad-shouldered, round-faced man in his early 30s named Bo Dogue, knew the Locklear family. Bo's family had been involved in socks, too. I grew up in the business, he said. We had a machine shop, and it closed down. There's no market for it anymore. It was entirely likely that Bo's family business had fabricated parts for Locklear Hosiery, the mill owned by Gina's uncle Roland, or Abel Hosiery, which was run by another uncle, her mother's brother. Roland and Terry's nephew, Gina's cousin David, also ran a mill. Bo didn't say how he knew the Locklears, and anyway, all those mills were gone now, like his family's machine shop. While we waited for our food, Gina and I chatted with Bo about the hosiery industry. He had a lot to say on the subject. Everybody had a job, he told me. That was a big thing throughout the town. This is a different world than it used to be. You remember that buzz that used to be here? Gina said. Bo nodded. Hosiery week. Painting a picture for me, he said, imagine Mardi Gras, but for socks. Every local business except for the restaurants shut down. There was a huge softball game that the whole town went to. There was a golf tournament. There were giveaways, banners hanging up across the roads, vendors all over town, bowling tournaments. Anything that you could really think of to bring together the people that made socks. Fort Payne hadn't hosted Hosiery Week in many years. I asked Bo and Gina why the town couldn't continue to celebrate the event. After all, there were a dozen or so sock mills still in operation, from major outfits like Cooper and Renfro to smaller mills like MEG. Bo shook his head. How do you celebrate something when you walk into a mill that's been there for 108 years and the owner says, "I'm sorry. I know your whole family has worked for my family, but this is the last check I'm going to give you." Bo's playful tone disappeared. Let me put it to you this way, he went on. Have you driven through Fort Payne? Have you seen the vast number of empty buildings? Can you imagine the number of bodies it took to fill those mill buildings with workers? Now imagine none of them getting a paycheck, and the nearest job is 40 miles in the direction that you've never been. Growing up, I never knew anyone's parents where they'd say, "I just can't get a job." It wasn't that way. Back then, even a shitty paying sock mill job was a guaranteed 300 plus a week. That's where you're really busting your hump all day. But if you were good and consistent, you could get a production job. And I knew guys making 700, 800 a week boarding socks or finishing socks or working in dye houses. If you had the desire, you could have gone and gotten a job. Now, if you have the desire, you got to take minimum wage to outbid the teenagers. I had driven through town and seen the empty buildings. Along Galt Avenue, Fort Payne's main street, half the storefronts were vacant. The downtown was drained of vitality. The commerce and bustle now out by the interstate exit, with its chain restaurants and hotels. Earlier that afternoon, I'd visited the Fort Payne Hosiery Museum, which had taken over one of the old storefronts downtown. It was there that I saw a fabled banner knitting machine up close and was shown the original steam whistle from the big mill. The whole experience made me sad. Fort Payne was rightfully proud of its history, but the exhibits spoke volumes about the places in America that used to make things. Instead of a thriving industry that brought prosperity to a community, now there was only a museum for it. Industry creates a texture to communities that goes beyond the strict number of people it employs. The sock mills had been active in the local community, holding blood drives and sponsoring the Boy Scouts and Little League. At one Pruitt plant, the employees had established a Helping Hands Fund. If someone had a medical bill or their house burned down or their child had a special need and they didn't have the money, the fund took care of it. It was financed by the workers themselves, who dropped $1 or $2 into a box each pay period. As the mill workers searched for new jobs and built new lives, they scattered, and that closeness was lost. Some relocated to Honduras with Gildan. Some found jobs driving forklifts at the Children's Place Distribution Center or working for another company in town. A few of the managers took roles with Westinghouse Electric in Birmingham. Rhonda Whitmire, one of MEG's employees, had worked for Pruitt Mills her whole adult life, almost 30 years, rising to become supervisor of quality control at Pruitt's Cherokee finishing plant, where she'd run the Helping Hands Fund. After Gildan closed the plant, Rhonda enrolled at the local community college to study nursing, but she didn't like it. She quit the program and took a job with Plasman, a local company that manufactured plastic parts for cars. We sanded parts with palm sanders. It was just one of those fill-in jobs that you hate to talk about, Rhonda told me, explaining that her brother-in-law saved her when he mentioned that Terry and Regina Locklear were hiring. Even after more than a decade, Rhonda remembered vividly the summer day when she and her co-workers stood in the Cherokee parking lot, crying and hugging one another and exchanging addresses and phone numbers, trying to stay connected. It makes you feel shocked and numb and hurt all at the same time, she said. It was just a heartbreaking thing. It was like a death, actually, the last day. When the mills left, the thing that had bound the community together, the work that had given the people of Fort Payne a common purpose and identity for an entire century, that was gone. Our food came out, and Bo rang us up. I love socks, and I grew up in it, and there's a special place in it for me, he said. But there's a lot of animosity towards the sock world now. He handed Gina and me our barbecue dinners, finished with the subject. Let's get some grub on. I was impressed by Gina's tireless drive and iron will. For all the challenges she faced, for all the economic devastation around her, she would not be deterred. But the more time I spent with her, the more I also noticed cracks in that cheery, determined front. The business remained touch and go. The orders for her parents' side slowed again, and MEG had to lay off 15 people and reduce to one shift. Gina's organic lines alone could not support the mill. The future still felt precarious. Sometimes, a tone of worry and even fear would creep into Gina's voice when she was talking about the future of her business. Her parents were getting older. What would happen if they had health problems and decided to retire, or when they died? Some years back, Vance had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. He'd had 3 surgeries to slow the symptoms, including having wires implanted in his brain to stop his tremors, but it was a degenerative disease, and it was starting to slow him some at work. When Gina spoke of Vance's condition and the possibility of losing him, her voice thickened with emotion. He's truly the backbone of our socks, she repeated to me. I don't know what I'd do without Vance. She was also worried about her own future. Her sister already had a family over in Coleman, and Gina had thought about having children, too, but with her crazy schedule, how? Her weekly commute from Birmingham was exhausting and, in the long term, unsustainable. There was always some crisis at the mill to deal with, and living 90 minutes away complicated that. The Angies were like misbehaving kids, forever acting up. That pointed to another problem. Angies were fast becoming outdated, like the banners before them, and sourcing parts was getting harder and harder. These worries hovered in the background of Gina's life like time bombs, and she went cold with fear if she thought about them for too long. Tough and determined as she was, her business was fragile. I'll just be honest, it's been a struggle, she said. It was only when she was making socks that her stress and worries dissipated. When Gina Locklear was engaged in the craft she loved, a calm, single-minded focus came over her. One afternoon, I watched Gina working on a new design, another beloved camellia flower. She was in the office kitchen looking over samples, or swatches, piled on a folding table. She was joined by Rhonda Whitmire. Now in her early 50s, Rhonda packaged online orders and inspected socks as MEG's quality control manager. Unofficially, she was Gina's in-house design consultant. An excellent colorist, Rhonda created color palettes for Zcano designs, and spent more and more of her time in a product development role. We're small around here, Gina said, and we all wear a lot of hats. Gina held up a sample of the camellia sock. It was just a stub of fabric. To save yarn, a sample sock was knit only a few inches long, just enough to see the design being considered. Each flower had clusters of rose-colored petals, and the edge of each petal was outlined in brown yarn. Curling vines made of blue yarn and leaves in a darker blue were knit on a green base. We love viney things, Gina said. And I also felt the pattern had a romantic, antique quality about it, and I really loved that. Still, something was off to her eye. Call me crazy, Gina said to Rhonda. What do you think about switching it? Making the vine color the leaf. And then doing denim for the vine. Denim vine, navy leaf, said Rhonda, using shorthand Pantone names. Might get it better, might not, Gina said. Rhonda headed back to the knitting room to have another sample made. The camellia would be sold in 3 colorways. Gina had to figure out combinations that would look good together yet be distinct and appealing to customers. Between the heel, toe, and base colors, plus the various colors within the design, there were almost infinite possibilities. It's amazing how something so small, a couple of knitted rows in a sock, can throw the whole thing off, Gina said. And also, you have to consider, I'm not a designer. I don't know the technical approach, so I stumble a lot. My husband got me a book about color theory. But I think feeling my way is better. Gina noticed socks everywhere she went and was constantly making notes for future designs. She loved playing with color, pattern, texture. I can get inspired by a car sitting in front of a building and how the colors go together. One early color-blocked sock was inspired by a Diane von Furstenberg dress. Rhonda returned with a new version. I like the vine part, Rhonda said, showing Gina the sample. Now it's the leaf. I'm just wondering what eggplant would do. Gina studied the new sample, hesitating, still unsatisfied. Then she homed in on a tiny detail. Each leaf had a dark line down the middle, just 1 or 2 knitted rows to mimic the midrib of a real leaf. Gina said, if we change the center of the leaf, could that work? Rhonda nodded. I see exactly what you're talking about. Rhonda marched back out to the knitting room, and this time I followed. She turned down a row and stopped at the machine where Vance stood waiting. Opposite them was the sample cart, which functioned much like a painter's palette, piled with spools of yarn in fantastic shades: purple orchid, misty rose, orange pop Gulf Coast, French roast, coral, cornflower, eggplant, clear water, aqua, asphalt. Rhonda handed Vance the unsatisfactory sample and pointed out the change that Gina wanted. Reaching up, Vance found the spool on the creel that corresponded to the central vein of the leaf in the pattern that he'd coded. He swapped out the yarn. He pressed a button. The fingers bobbed, the needles hammered. When the new sample popped out of the vacuum tube a minute later, Rhonda grabbed it and walked back to the kitchen. Let's see, Gina said, holding all 3 versions in her hands. Her face lit up in pleasure. Oh my lord, that's beautiful. This is my favorite sock, let me just go ahead and tell you. I wish they all turned out this way. Because I am absolutely in love with those colors. In love. In love. It's gonna be a major seller, Rhonda said. Gina kept growing her business, and around 2018, she passed a milestone. Her brand could now support itself without the help of her parents' private label orders. It wasn't like she saw numbers on a spreadsheet and bells went off. It was more of a feeling. Orders for her socks were rolling in steadily, and she was confident they would continue. One day, a truck drove down Airport Road and delivered 5 brand new knitting machines. The Italian-made Lonati machines, which cost $40,000 each, were next-generation technology. Lonatas had greater pattern capability than Angie's and could knit socks and close the toes all in one process, eliminating that extra, labor-intensive step. It meant that Maria Pasquale, a mill worker who had moved between the MEG and Zcano sides, jumping in wherever she was needed, could stop spending so much time seaming and help Gina full-time in fulfillment. While her parents continued to use Angie's to make basic white socks, Gina put the Lonatas on her line. The company sent a technician from Italy to show Vance how they worked. 2 years later, the mill ordered 5 more. It'd taken nearly a decade, but Gina's brands, my babies, she called them, were sturdy enough to stand on their own.